Sophia never imagined how heavy silence could feel. 4 months, her tiny apartment had been consumed by it, no laughter, no comforting hum of another person's presence, just the echo of her own thoughts. She was alone, utterly and completely. Her mother's death a year ago had left a chasm in her life that she hadn't been able to fill. Her father had vanished long before she was old enough to remember him, leaving Sophia and her mother to weather life's storms together. But now, with her mother gone, there was no one left. The loneliness was suffocating. Every holiday, every milestone, every small victory reminded her of the void. She didn't just grieve her mother, she grieved the absence of anyone to call family. Despite the crushing isolation, Sophia pushed herself forward. She had no choice. Her mother's passing had left her with a mountain of bills and no safety net. She juggled 2 part-time jobs, neither of which paid enough to cover the basics, and spent her nights poring over job postings, hoping for something better. Welcome to Emotion Lines. This story is about to get really interesting, so if you're enjoying it, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Let's keep going. One morning, a listing for an office assistant at a construction company caught her eye. The pay wasn't glamorous, but it was steady and the position promised room for growth. Sophia knew she couldn't afford to pass up the opportunity. She had one thing she always carried with her to remind her of her mother. An old silver ring, simple but elegant, with an inscription etched into the inside. "Where there's hope," it read. Her mother had never explained the meaning behind the words, but Sophia cherished it as a link to the woman who had been her entire world. On the morning of the interview, Sophia stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the navy blazer she had borrowed from a thrift store. It didn't fit perfectly, but it was enough to look professional. She slipped the ring onto her finger as she always did and took a deep breath. "This is just another step," she told herself. "Mom would want me to keep going." The construction company's office was bustling when she arrived, a sharp contrast to the stillness she had grown used to. Workers came and went, carrying blueprints and tools, their voices a mix of determination and camaraderie. Sophia felt out of place among them, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. She sat in the waiting area, clutching her resume, trying to steady her breathing. Each candidate who emerged from the interview room seemed more polished, more experienced, more confident. Self-doubt gnawed at her as she stared at her hands, the silver ring catching the light. When her name was finally called, Sophia stood on shaky legs and entered the office of Mr. Harper, the foreman. The room was cramped but orderly, with blueprints spread across the desk and a hard hat hanging from the chair. "Ms. Hayes?" he said, extending a calloused hand. "Yes," Sophia replied, her voice barely steady. She shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip and the lines of hard work etched into his face. The interview started with standard questions, her experience, her goals, but it quickly became clear that Mr. Harper valued honesty over pretense. Sophia answered as sincerely as she could, admitting her lack of expertise but emphasizing her willingness to learn. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Mr. Harper's eyes fell on her hand. "That ring?" he said, his voice softening. "Where did you get it?" Sophia blinked, caught off guard. "It was my mother's," she explained. "She wore it every day. It's all I have left of her." He leaned forward, studying it closely. "May I see it?" Hesitant but curious, Sophia slipped the ring off and handed it to him. He turned it over in his hand, his expression shifting from surprise to something deeper, something that looked like recognition. From his pocket he pulled out a ring of his own. It was worn just like hers, with an inscription inside, "There's always light." Sophia's breath caught as he placed the 2 rings together. The phrases aligned perfectly, creating a complete sentence. "Where there's hope, there's always light." The room seemed to hold its breath as Mr. Harper looked at her, his voice trembling. "Sophia, I think I'm your uncle." Sophia froze in her seat, staring at Mr. Harper as if he had grown a second head. "What?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "I'm your uncle," Mr. Harper repeated, his tone steady but filled with emotion. He placed the 2 rings side by side on the desk, their inscriptions perfectly aligned. "Your mother. She was my sister." Sophia blinked rapidly, her mind reeling. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she stammered. "I don't have any family. My mom never mentioned you. Ever." Mr. Harper sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "I can only imagine what you're feeling right now, but I promise you, I'm not lying. Your mother and I, we were very close once. Life just pulled us apart." Sophia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is too much," she said, shaking her head. I need to go." "Wait," Mr. Harper called after her. Sophia, please. I know this is a lot to take in, but if you want answers, I'm here. Anytime. Sophia didn't respond. She grabbed her bag and walked out of the office, her legs moving on autopilot as her mind spun in 1,000 different directions. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. An uncle? Her mother never once mentioned having a brother. Who was this man, and why was he claiming to be her family? The possibility felt absurd, almost laughable, yet the matching rings and the way he spoke with such earnestness. It unsettled her. For the next 2 days, Sophia barely left her apartment. The world outside seemed too overwhelming, and the revelation or potential fabrication was all she could think about. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Mr. Harper's words over and over. Your mother and I were very close once. The claim gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. Could it be true? So, why had her mother never spoken about him? She was torn between wanting answers and wishing she could erase the entire encounter from her memory. On the third morning, after yet another sleepless night, Sophia sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee. Her eyes drifted to the storage closet where she kept a few old boxes of her mother's belongings. She hesitated for a moment before getting up and dragging them out into the living room. The boxes were filled with memories, faded photographs, handwritten letters, trinkets her mother had cherished. Sophia sifted through them slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. A wave of nostalgia and grief washed over her with each item she touched. Then she found it, a photograph tucked inside an envelope. The image stopped her cold. It was her mother, much younger, her face radiant with happiness. She was standing beside a young man, both of them grinning widely. The man had his arm draped protectively around her, and there was a warmth between them that was unmistakable. Sophia turned the photograph over, her heart pounding. Written in her mother's neat handwriting was a date and 2 simple words. Her mother's name, followed by little brother. Sophia stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. Could it really be true? Her hands shook as she placed the photo on the table. The pieces were falling into place, but the realization felt surreal. The man in the photo looked like a younger version of Mr. Harper. Sophia leaned back against the couch, clutching the photo tightly. All the doubts, the disbelief, and the fear came rushing back, but this time, they were accompanied by something else, a flicker of hope. She had to know more. Sophia grabbed her phone and hesitated for a long moment before dialing the number Mr. Harper had given her. It rang twice before he picked up. Sophia? He said, his voice cautious but hopeful. I need to talk, she said quietly. Can we meet? Of course, he replied without hesitation. Whenever you're ready. Sophia exhaled, her grip tightening on the photograph. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Sophia walked into the small cafe, clutching the photograph tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as she spotted Mr. Harper seated at a corner table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up and smiled, a warm, hopeful expression that immediately softened her nerves. Thank you for coming, he said as she approached. Sophia slid into the seat across from him, placing the photograph on the table. Mr. Harper's eyes widened as he picked it up, his fingers brushing over the familiar faces. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice tinged with emotion. It was in one of my mother's old boxes, Sophia replied. I didn't know what to think when I found it. I still don't. Mr. Harper sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. Your mother was my everything, he began. My best friend, my big sister. She protected me, cared for me, and always made me feel like I mattered. He paused, his eyes misting over. But when our parents forced her into choices she didn't want to make, it broke her spirit. They tried to control every part of her life, and when she refused to obey, it turned into an ugly battle. She finally decided to leave, cutting all ties including with me. I begged her to stay, but she was adamant. She wanted a fresh start, far away from the pain. Sophia's throat tightened as she listened, the pieces of her mother's life falling into place in ways she'd never imagined. She wasn't angry with me, Mr. Harper continued, but she felt that staying in touch would only drag her back into the life she wanted to escape. I wrote letters, tried calling, but she never answered. Eventually I stopped trying. I thought I'd lost her forever. He looked at Sophia with a sad smile. Until I met you. Sophia wiped a tear from her cheek, overwhelmed by the weight of her mother's struggles and sacrifices. She never told me any of this, she whispered. I knew she was strong, but I didn't realize how much she had endured. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Mr. Harper said, and you are so much like her. I can see it in your strength, in your determination. Meeting you. It feels like I've been given a second chance. Like fate brought us together. Sophia's lip trembled as she looked at him. I felt so alone since she passed. But now it feels like she's still looking out for me even from wherever she is. Mr. Harper reached across the table and gently took her hand. You're not alone anymore, Sophia. You never have to feel that way again. You're family, and that means everything to me. 4 hours they sat in the cafe, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of each other's lives. Sophia found herself laughing at Mr. Harper's tales of her mother's mischievous youth and crying at the stories of their struggles. She realized that this man, who had been a stranger just days ago, now felt like a part of her. By the time they left, the sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow over the city. As they stepped outside, Mr. Harper turned to her. Sophia, he said softly, I never had children of my own, but if you're willing, I'd like to be there for you, like a father would. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. I'd like that, she said, her voice breaking. They embraced, two souls bound by loss but finding hope in each other. For Sophia, the hole her mother's death had left in her heart didn't feel as empty anymore. And for Mr. Harper, a life once marked by loneliness now held new purpose. From that day forward, they were no longer two strangers brought together by chance. They were family, a bond forged through grief, love, and the belief that even in the darkest times there's always light. Thank you for watching this heartwarming story on Emotion Lines. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.